¿Por qué es importante que estemos juntos en esto? Porque la región tiene que estar unida y me parece que hay mucho conocimiento en la región que todavía no está explotado comercialmente como podría ser, y esta es la mejor manera de hacerlo.
Tenemos la proyección de cada año generar y compartir nuevas experiencias entre aquellos que contribuyen a la innovación. Queremos cambiar el cómo lo hemos estado haciendo en Latinoamérica. Queremos generar la unión de los países, queremos colaborar.
Our virtual platform on technology foresight, Prospecta America, will support OAS member states in identifying and mapping future trends and technological development of critical importance for the Americas.
Este esfuerzo, el cual viene siendo apoyado por la Organización de los Estados Americanos, nos permitirá tener una gran información para poder mapear estas iniciativas de innovación y poder que ellas contribuyan al crecimiento económico, a la competitividad y al bienestar de nuestras naciones.
Como bien sabemos, nos encontramos ya en la cuarta revolución industrial, la que está cambiando rápidamente la forma en que se hace negocios, se produce, se consume y se genera bienestar y entretenimiento en el mundo. Es la mayor amenaza, tal vez la mejor oportunidad que tenemos en nuestras naciones.
The Inter-American Teacher Education Network, the I-10, is working to improve the quality of teachers with an emphasis on science, technology, engineering, and mathematics education. In 2019, the I-10 launched the first STEM Teacher Fellowship of the Americas. The Energy and Climate Partnership of the Americas, ECPA, is working with governments in the Caribbean to advance electric mobility and clean transport as the sub-region pursues energy independence. Under our Integrated Water Resource Management Program, SETI is responding to the demand for platforms and applications that capture and disseminate real-time information. This includes the expansion of Costa Rica's Plataforma Interactiva de Aplicación del Clima Tropical to the rest of Central America to help build resilient agriculture. The Inter-American Committee on Ports is building human and institutional capacity through public-private partnerships to address port modernization, logistics, and security. CooperaNet, SETI's multi-stakeholder platform for cooperation and partnerships, is being relaunched in 2019, responding to member states' call for a more robust hub for cooperation. As more consumers begin or end their shopping process online, SETI has entered into a partnership with the private sector to digitize millions of micro, small, and medium enterprises across the region.
Las buenas noticias es que sabemos por qué están fracasando, porque no son visibles. Y el hecho de que ahora lo puedan ser, haciéndolo ellas mismas, no solamente rompemos las tres barreras del tiempo, conocimiento y dinero, sino que les permitimos tener éxito y dejar de fracasar a los porcentajes que lo hacen ahora.
Es una herramienta que sin duda acerca a las MIPYMES hacia la demanda que hoy está migrando a Internet, y con eso pretendemos mejorar las ventas y el posicionamiento de las empresas pequeñas.
As we look to the future, the Executive Secretariat for Integral Development will continue to leverage cooperation and partnerships to expand our reach, proving that together we are much more than the sum of our 34 member states.
Me and my kids have been there for over an year right now. And children are friends. It doesn't matter where they come from.
Nosotros estamos en una zona netamente selvática. La línea de adyacencia va desde el norte hasta el sur, va desde Modesto Méndez hasta Aguas Turbias, tanto en el norte como en el sur. Esta línea tiene 215 kilómetros de extensión.
De allí vino él, se buscó creo con los de la OEA y de allí vino el proyecto para acá, para Judá. Y fue que lo dieron el terreno, y lo dieron todo que era mano de obra y el material para hacer las casas que están ahorita. Y por ese motivo estamos aquí viviendo todavía.
La misión continúa trabajando en la implementación de medidas de fomento de la confianza mientras aguarda el resultado del reclamo que está atendiendo la Corte Internacional de Justicia por la disputa marítima, territorial e insular. Nuestra oficina en la zona adyacencia realiza verificaciones a solicitud de ambos gobiernos, facilita reuniones y patrullajes conjuntos entre las Fuerzas Armadas y promueve una cultura de paz y cooperación entre las comunidades locales.
Children will be children. And they have harmony. They don't see each other as a different country, but they see each other that they're growing together.
Hoy, esta organización es el guardián regional en defensa de la democracia, la libertad y los derechos humanos. Los países se han comprometido con estos valores a través de instrumentos legales como la Carta Democrática Interamericana, la Convención Americana de Derechos Humanos y todas las demás convenciones interamericanas. Nuestro trabajo es mantener los más altos estándares. Debemos ser objetivos, analizar los hechos, denunciar cuando veamos corrupción, inequidad o amenazas a la libertad. En esos casos no podemos ser neutrales.
More than 100 years since the inauguration of this building, the OAS headquarters, our institution still brings together the peoples of the Americas to address our responsibilities as a partnership of nations. As we look to the future, our work must also focus on the construction of a positive agenda that continues to favorably impact millions of lives every day.
SETI's results for 2018 proves our effectiveness as a development partner, placing people at the center of our work and leveraging partnerships and cooperation to transform policy imperatives into action. With an eye on the rapidly changing global context, SETI is innovating to constructively address the emerging challenges and opportunities for the region. As part of our competitiveness program, SETI is designing precise tools to assess assets and capabilities in the productive sector to determine paths towards higher value goods and services. As our flagship program for partnerships, the Americas Competitiveness Exchange on Innovation and Entrepreneurship, the OAS, will continue to leverage good practices and the power of networks to increase trade and investment in the region.
For us, the role of the OAS is very important, connecting countries, connecting governments and private sector. and letting us know what other countries are doing it and how we can replicate that in our countries to enhance development.
For me, who has come here to look at how can we develop our own ecosystem, our own innovation hubs, our own accelerators, I think seeing this, touching, feeling it, seeing the transformation, seeing how quickly you made it happen is a testament to what is possible. So I believe all of us leave here stronger than ever.
The Working Group of Experts on Subnational Competitiveness, the GTEX, is our gateway program to promote local economic competitiveness policies alongside municipal and state-level governments, together with the private sector and academia.
Este tipo de reuniones te sirven para darte cuenta de todo lo que se está viviendo en América Latina sobre los temas de competitividad. Y hoy justamente en este sector estamos...
Segunda cabina de español. Segunda cabina de español. Ahí.
Buenos días.
Ok, Susana. Pero se escucha bien. Gracias. Y por último nos vamos a inglés. Cabina de inglés. Probando inglés.
Testing. Testing. This is Steve Mines, Channel 1.
Bien.
Se escucha bien.
Segunda cabina de inglés.
Hi, good morning. This is Kelly. Can you hear me?
Experiencias entre aquellos que contribuyen a la innovación. Queremos cambiar el cómo lo hemos estado haciendo en Latinoamérica. Queremos generar la unión de los países. Queremos colaborar.
Our virtual platform on technology foresight, Prospecta Americas, will support OAS member states in identifying and mapping future trends and technological development of critical importance for the Americas.
Este esfuerzo, el cual viene siendo apoyado por la Organización de los Estados Americanos, nos permitirá tener una gran información para poder mapear estas iniciativas de innovación y poder que ellas contribuyan al crecimiento económico, a la competitividad y al bienestar de nuestras naciones.
Como bien sabemos, nos encontramos ya en la cuarta revolución industrial, la que está cambiando rápidamente la forma en que se hace negocios, se produce, se consume y se genera bienestar y entretenimiento en el mundo. Es la mayor amenaza, tal vez la mejor oportunidad que tenemos en nuestras naciones.
The Inter-American Teacher Education Network, the I-10, is working to improve the quality of teachers with an emphasis on science, technology, engineering, and mathematics education. In 2019, the I-10 launched the first STEM Teacher Fellowship of the Americas. The Energy and Climate Partnership of the Americas, ECPA, is working with governments in the Caribbean to advance electric mobility and clean transport as the sub-region pursues energy independence. Under our Integrated Water Resource Management Program, SETI is responding to the demand for platforms and applications that capture and disseminate real-time information. This includes the expansion of Costa Rica's Plataforma Interactiva de Aplicación del Clima Tropical to the rest of Central America to help build resilient agriculture. The Inter-American Committee on Ports is building human and institutional capacity through public-private partnerships to address port modernization, logistics, and security. CooperaNet, SETI's multi-stakeholder platform for cooperation and partnerships, is being relaunched in 2019, responding to member states' call for a more robust hub for cooperation. As more consumers begin or end their shopping process online, SETI has entered into a partnership with the private sector to digitize millions of micro, small, and medium enterprises across the region.
Las buenas noticias es que sabemos por qué están fracasando, porque no son visibles. Y el hecho de que ahora lo puedan ser, haciéndolo ellas mismas, no solamente rompemos las tres barreras del tiempo, conocimiento y dinero, sino que les permitimos tener éxito y dejar de fracasar a los porcentajes que lo hacen ahora.
Es una herramienta que sin duda acerca a las MIPYMES hacia la demanda que hoy está migrando a Internet y con eso pretendemos mejorar las ventas y el posicionamiento de las empresas pequeñas.
As we look to the future, the Executive Secretariat for Integral Development will continue to leverage cooperation and partnerships to expand our reach, proving that together we are much more than the sum of our 34 member states.
Me and my kids have been there for over an year right now. And children are friends. It doesn't matter where they come from.
Nosotros estamos en una zona netamente selvática. La línea de adyacencia va desde el norte hasta el sur, va desde Modesto Méndez hasta Aguas Turbias, tanto en el norte como en el sur. Esta línea tiene 215 kilómetros de extensión.
De allí vino él, se evocó creo con los de la OEA y de allí vino el proyecto para acá, para Judá. Y fue que lo dieron el terreno, y lo dieron todo que era mano de obra y el material para hacer las casas que están ahorita. Y por ese motivo estamos aquí viviendo todavía.
La misión continúa trabajando en la implementación de medidas de fomento de la confianza mientras aguarda el resultado del reclamo que está atendiendo la Corte Internacional de Justicia por la disputa marítima, territorial e insular. Nuestra oficina en la zona de adyacencia realiza verificaciones a solicitud de ambos gobiernos, facilita reuniones y patrullajes conjuntos entre las Fuerzas Armadas y promueve una cultura de paz y cooperación entre las comunidades locales.
Children will be children. And they have harmony. They don't see each other as a different country, but they see each other that they're growing together.
Esta organización es el guardián regional en defensa de la democracia, la libertad y los derechos humanos. Los países se han comprometido con estos valores a través de instrumentos legales como la Carta Democrática Interamericana, la Convención Americana de Derechos Humanos y todas las demás convenciones interamericanas. Nuestro trabajo es mantener los más altos estándares. Debemos ser objetivos, analizar los hechos, denunciar cuando veamos corrupción, inequidad o amenazas a la libertad. En esos casos no podemos ser neutrales.
More than 100 years since the inauguration of this building, the OAS headquarters, our institution still brings together the peoples of the Americas to address our responsibilities as a partnership of nations. As we look to the future, our work must also focus on the construction of a positive agenda that continues to favorably impact millions of lives every day.
SETI's results for 2018 proves our effectiveness as a development partner, placing people at the center of our work and leveraging partnerships and cooperation to transform policy imperatives into action. With an eye on the rapidly changing global context, SETI is innovating to constructively address the emerging challenges and opportunities for the region. As part of our competitiveness program, SETI is designing precise tools to assess assets and capabilities in the productive sector to determine paths towards higher value goods and services. As our flagship program for partnerships, the Americas Competitiveness Exchange on Innovation and Entrepreneurship, the OAS, will continue to leverage good practices and the power of networks to increase trade and investment in the region.
For us, the role of the OAS is very important, connecting countries, connecting governments and private sector, and letting us know what other countries are doing it and how we can replicate that in our countries to enhance development.
For me, who has come here to look at how can we develop our own ecosystem, our own innovation hubs, our own accelerators, I think seeing this, touching, feeling it, seeing the transformation, seeing how quickly you made it happen is a testament to what is possible. So I believe all of us leave here stronger than ever.
The Working Group of Experts on Subnational Competitiveness, the GTEX, is our gateway program to promote local economic competitiveness policies alongside municipal and state-level governments, together with the private sector and academia.
Este tipo de reuniones te sirven para darte cuenta de todo lo que se está viviendo en América Latina sobre los temas de competitividad. Y hoy justamente en este sector estamos viendo sobre todo los temas de innovación tecnológica, pues que si hablamos de competitividad tenemos que hablar de tecnología. Y me está ayudando mucho para ver el panorama de ver lo que están haciendo otras ciudades y lo que podemos llegar a aplicar también nosotros en México.
The hub on the transfer and commercialization of technology is strengthening national innovation ecosystems by training budding entrepreneurs to take promising products and services from idea to market.
Porque es importante que estemos juntos en esto, porque la región tiene que estar unida y me parece que hay mucho conocimiento en la región que todavía no está explotado comercialmente como podría ser, y esta es la mejor manera de hacerlo.
Tenemos la proyección de cada año generar y compartir nuevas experiencias entre aquellos que contribuyen a la innovación. Queremos cambiar el cómo lo hemos estado haciendo en Latinoamérica. Queremos generar la unión de los países. Queremos colaborar.
Our virtual platform on technology foresight, Prospecta Americas, will support OAS member states in identifying and mapping future trends and technological development of critical importance for the Americas.
Este esfuerzo, el cual viene siendo apoyado por la Organización de los Estados Americanos, nos permitirá tener una gran información para poder mapear estas iniciativas de innovación y poder que ellas contribuyan al crecimiento económico, a la competitividad y al bienestar de nuestras naciones.
Como bien sabemos, nos encontramos ya en la cuarta revolución industrial, la que está cambiando rápidamente la forma en que se hace negocios, se produce, se consume y se genera bienestar y entretenimiento en el mundo. Es la mayor amenaza, tal vez la mejor oportunidad que tenemos en nuestras naciones.
The Inter-American Teacher Education Network, the I-10, is working to improve the quality of teachers with an emphasis on science, technology, engineering, and mathematics education. In 2019, the I-10 launched the first STEM Teacher Fellowship of the Americas. The Energy and Climate Partnership of the Americas, ECPA, is working with governments in the Caribbean to advance electric mobility and clean transport as the sub-region pursues energy independence. Under our Integrated Water Resource Management Program, SETI is responding to the demand for platforms and applications that capture and disseminate real-time information. This includes the expansion of Costa Rica's Plataforma Interactiva de Aplicación del Clima Tropical to the rest of Central America to help build resilient agriculture. The Inter-American Committee on Ports is building human and institutional capacity through public-private partnerships to address port modernization, logistics, and security. CooperaNet, SETI's multi-stakeholder platform for cooperation and partnerships, is being relaunched in 2019, responding to member states' call for a more robust hub for cooperation. As more consumers begin or end their shopping process online, SETI has entered into a partnership with the private sector to digitize millions of micro, small, and medium enterprises across the region.
Las buenas noticias es que sabemos por qué están fracasando, porque no son visibles. Y el hecho de que ahora lo puedan ser, haciéndolo ellas mismas, no solamente rompemos las tres barreras del tiempo, conocimiento y dinero, sino que les permitimos tener éxito y dejar de fracasar a los porcentajes que lo hacen ahora.
Es una herramienta que sin duda acerca a las MIPYMES hacia la demanda que hoy está migrando a Internet, y con eso pretendemos mejorar las ventas y el posicionamiento de las empresas pequeñas.
As we look to the future, the Executive Secretariat for Integral Development will continue to leverage cooperation and partnerships to expand our reach, proving that together we are much more than the sum of our 34 member states.
Me and my kids have been there for over an year right now. And children are friends. It doesn't matter where they come from.
Good morning, everyone. We will now finalize the phase of testing of audio and video for those connected virtually this morning. And present here in the room and having concluded the test, we have the following delegations: Belize, Bolivia, Brazil, Canada, Chile, Costa Rica, Dominica, El Salvador, Grenada, Honduras, Guatemala, Haiti, Honduras, Mexico, Panama, Paraguay, Peru, the Dominican Republic, St. Kitts and Nevis, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, St. Lucia, Suriname, and Venezuela. We have quorum, Madam Chair. Thank you.
Thank you, ASG. Good morning, esteemed colleagues. Now that the Secretariat has verified the quorum, I have the honor to declare open this special meeting of the Permanent Council, which has been convened to celebrate the International Day of the World's Indigenous Peoples and the 5th Inter-American Week for Indigenous Peoples, being observed under the theme, the role of Indigenous women in the preservation and transmission of traditional knowledge in the Americas. Before proceeding to adopt the order of business, I would like to acknowledge and thank our distinguished speakers for their participation in this important meeting, and I extend to them a warm welcome on behalf of the OAS Permanent Council. In accordance with Article 43 of the Rules of Procedure, I submit for your consideration the draft agenda set out in document CPOD 2388/22. If there are no comments, we shall take it as adopted. In February 2018, This council adopted the resolution which established the Inter-American Week for Indigenous Peoples to be observed annually around August 9th. The resolution invites OAS member states to commemorate this week with activities that promote and highlight the culture of Indigenous peoples by sharing their traditions, recognizing and appreciating their languages, transmitting their history, and highlighting their contributions in different areas. It also urges the General Secretariat to commemorate this week with activities that contribute to the full recognition, exercise, and enjoyment of the rights of Indigenous peoples at the national and hemispheric levels. In that regard, we must note that the American Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, agreed upon after 70 years of negotiation, is the principal OAS instrument for the promotion and protection of the rights of the indigenous peoples of the Americas. To that end, in 2017, the OAS General Assembly adopted the Plan of Action on the American Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples 2017 to 2021, which, upon its expiration in 2021, was extended until 2026. It is within this context that today's special session of the OAS Permanent Council was convened to promote dialogue among national authorities, representatives of indigenous peoples, and member states with a view to advancing policies on the rights of indigenous peoples and ensuring their social inclusion in the Americas. The theme of this 5th Inter-American Week for Indigenous Peoples is the role of indigenous women in the preservation and transmission of traditional knowledge in the Americas. Traditional knowledge is at the core of the identity, cultural heritage, and livelihoods of indigenous peoples. The transmission of their generational knowledge is essential to the protection and promotion of their rights, and fundamental to achieving food security, environmental protection, and preservation of the world's cultural and biological diversity. There is no doubt that the contributions of indigenous peoples in the Americas have been critical to the development, cultural diversity, and environmental protection efforts of the hemisphere. Notwithstanding, indigenous peoples continue to be victims of discrimination, and historically they have suffered from exclusion, facing many challenges to the full exercise of their human rights. Indigenous women in particular face numerous societal challenges which impede their socio-economic progress and political inclusion. In spite of these hurdles, indigenous women play a formidable role in their societies. They are actively engaged in political conversations, raising issues which, though crucial to indigenous peoples, may not always receive adequate attention in the hemisphere. Some of these issues relate to the violation of their right to own, use, and control traditional lands, territories, and natural resources. They also fight to be included in decision-making processes that can impact their lives. From Alaska to Tierra del Fuego, indigenous women have contributed and continue to contribute to the preservation of ancestral knowledge, the promotion of rights, and the protection of the environment. Indigenous women leaders such as Micaela Bastidas, Rigoberta Menchú, Bartolina Sisa, Gregoria Pasa, Pine Leaf, Zitkala Sa, Patricia Velasquez, Tarsila Rivera, Mary Golda Ross, Deb Haaland, Susan Schoenhajo, Rosalina Tuyuk, Mina Cunningham, Maxima Acuna, Lottie Cunningham, Berta Cáceres, Jerry Rivera, Milagro Sala, Goina Wapichana, Sonia Guajajara, Dolores Cacuango, Maria de Jesus Patricia Martinez, Anna May Aquash, Elsie Knott, Molly Brandt, Anna Villa, Elisa Longkong, Liz Chikahe Churai, among many others. In conclusion, I would like to urge member states to make every effort to implement the American Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and its plan of action in their countries. Both instruments are of utmost importance in the promotion and protection of the rights of Indigenous women and in the preservation of traditional knowledge and biodiversity. Today's special session will highlight the important role played by Indigenous women in the promotion and preservation of traditional knowledge, as well as the urgent need to promote and protect their rights in the Americas. On behalf of the Permanent Council, I reiterate my warmest welcome to the speakers who have joined us today in this session, and I thank them in advance for their stellar work and commitment to advancing the causes of Indigenous peoples in the Americas. I also extend appreciation and thanks to the Assistant Secretary General and his entire team for organizing this special meeting and each of the commemorative events of the 5th Inter-American Week for Indigenous Peoples. Having said that, I will now welcome and offer the floor to the Secretary General of the OAS, Mr. Luis Almagro. Mr. Secretary General, welcome. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
The role of Indigenous women in the preservation and transmission of traditional knowledge in the Americas is the theme chosen this year to commemorate the International Year of Indigenous Peoples. Ambassadors, representatives of Indigenous peoples, dear friends, this week was chosen by the member states in February of 2018 to honor the sociocultural heritage and the legacy of Indigenous peoples. The celebrations held this week around the theme in observance of the International Day of Indigenous Peoples. Traditional knowledge is a key factor of the identity of Indigenous peoples, and in this regard, Indigenous women are a key piece in the conservation and transmission of traditional knowledge. They are the guardians of the scientific knowledge of traditional medicine, of languages, as well as the relationship of these peoples and the history of these peoples, which are orally transmitted from generation to generation. They also are healers in their communities, providers of food for their families, defenders of human rights as well in their communities. However, to date, they continue to suffer numerous forms of indiscrimination and violence. Indigenous women have fought against marginalization, racism, and exclusion, and have done so with resilience and perseverance. The path to a recognition of their rights suggests that they be considered in the private and public sphere. The elimination of historical discrimination that they have suffered for the sole reason of being Indigenous women. Despite these adverse conditions, Indigenous women have amply demonstrated a set of skills that recognize, and it is necessary for us to recognize and honor these efforts and the witness that they bear to fighting the structural difficulties faced by their families and communities. Currently, Indigenous women play a more important role in this globalized world under the scourge of the pandemic, both in the revitalization of traditional knowledge and the transmission and preservation of Indigenous languages, as well as in the application of ancestral traditional medicine. We call on international organizations and civil society to work together to protect these fundamental rights, and we adhere to the recommendations from the Commission on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, CEDAW, particularly the promotion, participation, and consultation of Indigenous women in the design, evaluation, and implementation of public policies that would be adopted for their full involvement, as well as to strengthen the political, social, economic conditions that would allow Indigenous women to organize, to be trained, and to make effective their individual as well as collective rights. In the cultural sphere, we must promote the development of their identity and allowing for the conditions to allow for them to have development schemes and projects that are compatible with their traditional values to improve the quality of life for their communities. In the sphere of labor relations, the highest gap of skills and work skills particularly is greatest between Indigenous and non-Indigenous workers, a number of percentage points higher than in other spheres. Added to this, when Indigenous women work in the informal labor sector, they are outside the protection schemes for workers. This leaves them in a more precarious socioeconomic situation. To combat this, we must promote the work that Indigenous women carry out in their own communities in consideration of their particular context, so as to empower them, to giving them economic autonomy and strengthen their cultural role and importance. We cannot forget to mention the specific issues of violence against Indigenous women. We are indebted to Indigenous women for this. In keeping with the democratic spirit in our hemisphere, we must address these injustices of our colonial past, and as a result must adopt the measures together with Indigenous communities to eradicate all forms of violence and discrimination. Finally, we must underscore the will of the OAS to improve the conditions and the lives of all Indigenous communities, particularly women. And along these lines, we will continue to work. It is impossible to think of the Americas without including the role of the Indigenous peoples, their traditional knowledge, their cultural heritage, and we must recognize the key role that Indigenous women have played in the past and continue to do so presently. We must work together to build together a more democratic and fair and just hemisphere for all.
Colleagues, following the order established in our agenda, we will now proceed to the presentations by our distinguished guests, beginning with a presentation by Ms. Carmen Caifil, lawyer of the Mapuche people. Ms. Caifil, welcome. You have the floor.
Mari Compuche, Fachanta Kui Tufachita Gumeo, Carmen Caifil Piñen Inche, Mapuche Somos Inche, Ticalgo y Mapumeo en Itugún. Mi Mapu está ubicado a 16 kilómetros de San José la Mariquina, Chile.
It's 16 kilometers where people are working in cattle raising and agriculture. The Mapuche communities are devastated by the monoculture of eucalyptus trees, not indigenous to our region. I did a master's in legal rights and work as a lawyer on indigenous rights. And my story is not so different from that of many other Mapuche women who continue to operate in other spheres of work without forgetting our Mapuche history and tradition, together with other members of my Mapuche nation in Chile. This is the reality that I know. First, I affirm that we are a people that has a special relationship to nature. We're a people from the earth and have a harmonious relationship with nature, Secondly, I affirm that in the nation of Mapuche, the role of men and women have occupied different roles in our political and social reality. In our story, in our history, we can find the role of women warriors, Alonco, Hamachi, Laguchuchefe, Ricafe, Kamaska, keepers of the seeds, and weavers, keepers of our traditions and of our territories, who have occupied political spheres that have often been held by aristocratic white men. Some of these are today deputies in our National Congress. Natividad Yanquileo, Elisa Loncón, Rosa Calquileo, who have worked as constitutional representatives for the Mapuche people. However, there is a civilizing role also by women in my community of transmitting from one generation to another, principally, the values of Mapuche society, our spirituality, our language, our culture, and our relationship to nature. Through the work of raising children, we've worked also without losing our Mapuche essence. Mapuche leaders have also occupied spiritual roles, as is the case of Machi, who heals ailments in our community and who have headed the ceremony, the social cultural, in which we thank the earth and renew our commitment to the protection of the earth. Additionally, we have been environmental defenders and defenders of our territory. This special relationship to nature has motivated us to protect the territory that is ours, safeguarding our sociocultural heritage sites as the Francisca Linconao, Macarena Valdez, from the Maquillawa coast, and other many women who have struggled at great personal expense. They have been persecuted, jailed, criminalized, or in some cases of extreme violence, assassinated. However, when it comes to the role of indigenous women in Chilean society, we see cases of discrimination, a lack of opportunity in labor markets, the lack of indigenous women in decision-making structures, and violence. These are phenomena that are disruptive to the role of women who are used to living harmoniously. However, as we have sought to advance the development of indigenous peoples as a whole and as women, we know that there is discrimination against indigenous women because of their poverty and because of their character as indigenous people. We have to work to guarantee a focus that would be adjusted to their particularities from infancy. The sisters of other indigenous peoples in Chile have also played other roles, being active participants both in the preservation of our culture and territories of our peoples, and finally in participating decision-making structures such as our National Congress and our Constitutional Convention. These are women who have made visible the rights of these people and demands for participation in our region. I call for an understanding of indigenous women, understanding their role to guarantee the full exercise of their rights so that we will never be ashamed of being part of indigenous communities in our region.
I now offer the floor to Mr. Sergio Sevilla Perez, Vice Minister of Peace of Costa Rica. Vice Minister Sevilla, welcome. You have the floor.
Muy buenos días, señora presidenta.
Good morning, Madam Chair, and also Mr. Secretary General of the OAS, as well as all of those present at this meeting. For Costa Rica, it is an honor to have been invited to this celebration in commemoration of the International Day of Indigenous Peoples. Today is a day in which we must reflect and work towards the full enjoyment of the rights of indigenous peoples that inhabit each of our countries, respecting their own cultural, religion, language, and worldviews. Costa Rica is not a country that has been particularly well known for its indigenous population. However, in the 24 territories of our country, there are 8 indigenous ethnic groups: the Ngambe, Brunca, Broran, Bribi, Cabecar, Malecu, Chorotega, and Huetar. They are located in different regions, in different territories throughout our country. Although they do not represent a large part of our population, they continue to maintain their ancient cultures and in many cases live from the same natural resources that they once depended on. I myself am not indigenous, but I recognize that, as is the case for many of us here, we have indigenous blood in our veins. Over the course of many decades, our nations have been indebted to these populations, to these peoples who have lived without having and enjoying the same rights as the rest of the citizens of our countries. As the person responsible for the indigenous issues portfolio appointed by the government of Costa Rica in the current government, I've been able to meet representatives of some of these peoples in the territories, and regardless of their culture, language, or their cosmology, all of these have a common factor: urgently addressing the systematic violation of their fundamental rights. In the last few months of our work, we have been able to conclude that a lack of opportunities for our indigenous brothers and sisters in areas of education, health, transportation, and roadway infrastructure or bridges would allow them equal access to basic services together with the rest of our country's population. Families, children, young people, men and women will sometimes have to walk for hours to be able to reach their work places or schools. And this is an example that despite the challenges, these are people who have been persistent, resilient, and resisted these challenges. These indigenous people, despite the insufficient actions of previous governments, have continued to fight and continue fighting today tirelessly to exercise their rights in very adverse circumstances. One issue that is still to be addressed in our countries and our states, and is the focus of this Inter-American Week, is the role of indigenous women within the communities, the contribution and the challenges for member states to make possible their full development. We know that a new society that will emerge in Costa Rica as a result, the new society that emerged in Costa Rica as a result of our independence, meant that the role of women involved a series of obstacles that needed to be addressed, rights that had been denied to them. Indigenous women the case of indigenous women has not been different from this in facing significant obstacles, and based on the double condition of being both a woman and an indigenous person. Despite the struggles that women in our country have experienced to consolidate their political and social rights and addressing gender equity, the participation of indigenous women has not been allowed as it should have been, and there's significant discrimination in the patriarchal ideology and identities. Even today, in many communities, indigenous women are not able to participate in the development of their own communities and associations.
en los procesos de creación de vida, herencia cultural y cosmovisión. Y sobre todo,
women are very important in the process of transmission of culture. Briefly, and in order not to extend over time, it is of great importance to indicate that currently Costa Rican indigenous women participate in the right to vote, but they had not held political positions until this administration. We now have Deputy Sonia Rojas in our Legislative Assembly. This is a message of hope for the vindication of rights of indigenous peoples under a gender equity approach. Also, we have seen slowly but steadily how they have begun to recognize themselves and what are their proposals for action at all levels: economic, environmental, health, against violence, power, and decision-making. In the media, in order to be included in channels of participation, indigenous women are currently being trained, which is partly thanks to the result of their involvement in these networks of social organizations. These are arenas where they can raise and analyze issues that affect them, not only individually but collectively. An example of this are new structures that have emerged in some indigenous territories, such as women's groups, associations of entrepreneurs, different territorial indigenous consultation groups created under a gender approach, women leaders who fight for the safeguarding of their ancestral traditions, education, environment, and protection of Mother Earth. For the last 4 months, we have had Idalia Andrade de Gracia of the Ngabri Buglé people as the first Saik woman. We know that this awareness will not immediately change the vertical gender relations to which they are subjected, nor their direct access to channels of citizenship, but it would lead to their empowerment, and not only with their own people, but within the framework of our society, they can change the situation. To this end, they must recognize their aptitudes and they must struggle for their education and training. The government undertakes this challenge and the commitment to this fight, knowing that they can help them achieve their goals and that the government can provide them with the necessary tools for their training and active involvement in the organization of their community, their participation in the economy and decision making. Likewise, to preserve the customs, gastronomy, and language of these peoples for new generations, together with its position as leaders to struggle for the rights and projection of their people. Indigenous women today are organizing themselves, breaking different barriers, family and cultural barriers that had relegated them to limited participation. Today we are seeing how they are becoming politically and socially aware, working on their own potential and recognizing their important role to be able to change their long history of marginalization and discrimination. Likewise, hand in hand with our indigenous brothers, they have given our countries a richness in their diverse cultures, languages, methods of agriculture, care of the environment and the earth, their beliefs, songs, their culinary arts, and other heritage that we must not let die. This leads us to undertake a commitment to be able to preserve this precious legacy and to improve their quality of life. Dear compatriots, this leads us to reflect today, and it calls upon us to pause and review the public policies that have been formulated by our governments, bearing in mind the American Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, to address the specific issues of their realities, needs, and expectations. This should be aimed to guarantee the respect of their human rights. The chair is asking for the speaker to please wrap up his presentation. We must respect their human rights and their values and implement a legacy in our education system. Thank you very much, and I hope to see you again next August 9th.
Now offer the floor to Ms. Cristina Males Yaselga, Vice Prefect of the Province of Imbabura, Ecuador. Ms. Males Yaselga, welcome. You have the floor.
Good morning, everyone. Excellencies, dear brothers and sisters of the different indigenous peoples of Abya Yala, our Americas. I would like to extend my warmest greetings to the organizers of this important event and congratulate them for providing these arenas to allow us to address the challenges that indigenous women face. I am Cristina Males. I am from the Quichua Otavalo people, and I am the Vice Prefect of the province of Imbabura. This is one of the 23 provinces of Ecuador. I am from a province that is very diverse with respect to culture and heritage, where the fruits are provided by Pachamama. Also, the presence of indigenous peoples, the Awa nationality, the Afro-Ecuadorian people with whom we live in a unique and diverse space, keeping alive our customs and traditions, which has allowed us to obtain the recognition of World Geopark by UNESCO. I would like to share with you my experience as a woman and indigenous leader of Imbabura. In Latin America, and especially Ecuador, the struggle of the indigenous peoples in looking for their recognition of rights has been persistent throughout history. The only aim is to achieve profound changes in society, promoting the construction of a plurinational and intercultural state, which ensures the exercise of the rights of peoples and nationalities as provided for under the Constitution of the Republic and several international instruments. In the current context, indigenous women are a fundamental part for the defense of rights and equality, as well as for the defense of territories, socio-political and economic systems in line with the natural laws of the Pachamama, and in general, for the preservation of the culture of indigenous peoples. Indigenous women in their territories, communities, and organizations have shown that we are essential to keep traditional knowledge alive for the conservation, transmission, and revitalization of indigenous languages, as well as for the coordination of actions and the use of traditional ancestral medicine and the preservation of life. In Ecuador and in almost all developing countries, women in agriculture play an important role because they contribute to household food security. They care for their families, they manage natural resources, and they are essential to resolve disputes in the area of indigenous justice. They also are fighting climate change and protecting the environment and biodiversity. Many indigenous women in the Americas are actively involved in political conversations. They raise issues that are crucial to indigenous peoples and that do not always receive sufficient attention. We are also struggling to be included in decision-making processes that can impact our lives. Unfortunately, indigenous women still face many kinds of discrimination and violence based on gender, ethnicity, and socioeconomic status. Furthermore, political participation, especially of indigenous women, is still very limited. I am the first indigenous woman to hold a provincial level position, which has allowed me to build a social and communication relationship closer to the women of our peoples who face multiple needs, and also to jointly manage projects and governance strategies that ensure equitable, fair, and supportive development. The prefecture of Imbabura promotes various road projects, irrigation projects, and environmental and productive development in order to create optimal conditions, especially in rural communities. However, the exercise of governance means we must look at territory in a comprehensive manner that is more inclusively. So during the provincial parliament of Imbabura, which is the highest level of citizen participation, there was the need to build an ordinance that ensures the rights of people and nationalities of Imbabura, that they can fight against discrimination and a history of exclusion. The prefecture of Imbabura, through a process of collective consultation, has developed an instrument that is to promote economic and distribution of economic resources. These are exclusive projects for ethnic minorities. They contain guidelines to directives to include women in the different projects so that there is a level playing field. This ordinance has been possible thanks to the joint efforts of public, private, and community actors, such as autonomous provincial governments of Ecuador, the Human Rights Secretariat, the National Council for the Equality of Peoples and Nations, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Human Mobility, and the German agency GIZ. We are also working or have worked with municipal governments and representatives of indigenous peoples in order to create this instrument and reach the most vulnerable sectors. Currently, this ordinance document has been reviewed and approved by the Legislative Committee of the Provincial Government of Imbabura. This local instrument, with regard to its application, recognized the mandatory observance in the province of Imbabura of the rights of indigenous peoples. We are sure that this experience, so it can be replicated in other provinces of the country and regions of the American continent, allow us to address structural causes of inequality that indigenous peoples face. We are in a new area of our world and local history where indigenous women are gradually gaining impulse to be able to participate and take decisions. It is important to pave the way so that new generations can change the world, a world without paradigms, without fears, without restrictions. Above all, restrictions on rights. These are aspects that have chained us to underdevelopment and poverty in the past. We want our new generations to go even further and be able to build an inclusive state with all actors of society. Thank you very much.
I now give the floor to Commissioner Juan Everardo Choxom and Commissioner Maximiliano Marroquin Feliciano from the Presidential Commission Against Discrimination and Racism against Indigenous Peoples of Guatemala. Welcome, Commissioners. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, Chair of the Permanent Council, Ambassador, Mr. Secretary General Luis Almagro, Assistant Secretary General, Ambassador Nestor Mendez, Ambassador Rita Claverty, Permanent Representative of Guatemala to the OAS. Representatives, observers, good day. It is an honor for me to be able to represent the state of Guatemala at this special session of the Permanent Council to commemorate the celebration of the Inter-American Week for Indigenous Peoples. and to focus on the role of indigenous women in the preservation and transmission of traditional knowledge in the Americas. On this opportunity, our country applauds and ratifies its commitment to continue working on the issue of indigenous peoples to be able to bring about an end to social inequalities. Guatemala has 4 peoples, the Maya, Xinca, Ladino, y Garifuna. Indigenous peoples represent 43% of the population of our country, according to the official census of 2018. Before colonization, the Mayas, men and women, inhabited our territories, developed great knowledge in philosophy, astronomy, literature, architecture, math, medicine, and arts, among others, their own knowledge. Currently, in many places in the Americas, the violations of human rights of indigenous women persist. Indigenous women are ignored. It is ignored that they preserve and transmit knowledge in the region. In our National Book of Guatemala, the elements of men and women represented by Petep and Pupoma are complementary since the creation of the universe and the human beings made of corn. Indigenous women in Guatemala are strong and represent life. They multiply our cultural life and lead to our new generations. We want to also underline their contribution to our culture, especially to preserving the ancestral knowledge of Mayas, despite challenges faced. In Guatemala, there are efforts to vindicate rights of indigenous peoples, as we see in paragraph 2A of the Declaration on Indigenous Rights, which provides for overcoming any discrimination against indigenous peoples. And to do this, we must have everyone, all citizens, working together to be able to transform our attitudes, our behavior, so that we can have a true, peaceful, harmonious society. We need several measures to be approved to do this. We need to define as a crime racism and discrimination, violations of human rights of indigenous peoples through the educational system. We also need to promote agencies and bodies that can protect our indigenous people's rights. Now I would like to give the floor to my colleague, Commissioner Maximiliano Marroquín. Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair. The state of Guatemala has undertaken actions to fight against discrimination against indigenous women. They have a call center that is free. It works 24/7 and it takes calls in indigenous languages. It is also providing care to indigenous women who have been victims of violence in coordination with pertinent agencies. We have the Office of the Defense of Indigenous Women and a plan under that agency. And 4 results have been identified: basic access to education, work, and healthcare; 2, political participation; 3, access to justice; and 4, prevention services, legal advice services, and psychological services to help women who have been victims of violence. The same office of the defender has also been participating in a group to fight violence against women. This in order to try to identify the needs of these women and also to prepare a humanitarian need project and have a response plan. This would benefit indigenous women who live in remote areas. This is to have interventions based on the needs of these women within the communities, and this would be socially and linguistically appropriate. Through the Presidential Commission against discrimination and racism against indigenous peoples, we have 11 cases of discrimination against indigenous women, this from 2020 to 2022. We have also provided advice to women with respect to discrimination cases. In the first quarter of 2022, 1,400 cases were recorded of violence against indigenous women. As part of the defense of indigenous women in the justice system, we have an agency that is studying the perspective and of women, and we have been through this group helping women who belong to the Silka people. Another instrument that we have to be able to support indigenous women and their human rights is the National Plan to Eradicate Violence Against Indigenous Women. This was updated through the coordination with the Presidential Commission on Women and the Commission on Inter-Family Violence. Lessons were learned. And also we identified challenges with respect to research, analysis, statistics, and institutional strengthening. Chair, once again, I thank you for the opportunity to be able to participate in this important commemoration. We must recall that indigenous women have made important steps in decision-making processes of some peoples, and they are local and national leaders. They are defending their culture and their people. It is necessary to continue to support the role of indigenous women in the Americas in all arenas and promote the preservation and transmission of ancestral knowledge. Thank you very much.
I now give the floor to Ms. Sarah Omi, President of the Mesoamerica Women's Territorial Leaders Coordinating Committee of Panama. Ms. Omi, welcome. Shall now proceed to the next item. I will now request that the Secretariat show a video address by Ms. Rosilda Nunta Guimaraes, Vice Minister of Interculturality of the Ministry of Culture of Peru. Please proceed, Secretariat.
Greetings to the Chair of the Permanent Council of the Organization of American States. On this special day, the International Day of the World's Indigenous Peoples. In Peru, we have over 50 indigenous peoples, and we have many indigenous language, and we also have different indigenous peoples who are isolated voluntarily, and we are celebrating this important day as a state, ensuring and promoting this way the collective rights of our brothers and sisters from the different indigenous peoples that exist in our country. At the Ministry of Culture, we have different public policies. For example, specifically the public policy on language, indigenous language, which are both oral and written. In the framework of this policy, citizens who are indigenous peoples may receive assistance in their language. We also have a Center for Indigenous Interpretation so that official documents of the state might be translated, and also information on illnesses and COVID, which are translated. This is done by the interpreters we have from different indigenous peoples. We have over 500 interpreters and translators in different indigenous languages. In that context, we are celebrating the International Day of the World's Indigenous Peoples. Another important policy that we have are policies on those indigenous peoples who are isolated or are in initial contact. We have a report where we recognize the 4 peoples who are in the reserve in the Loreto region. We have other important initiatives such as intercultural interpreters. We have 40 interpreters of this kind. They are from different peoples. They take information to their peoples on COVID, with respect to conflicts, among other issues, so that indigenous peoples can realize their collective rights. Through the Ministry of Culture, we continue to promote an intercultural citizenship free of discrimination. With the participation of indigenous peoples, we will continue to work in a coordinated manner to ensure the collective rights of our indigenous peoples. In the government, through the Ministry of Culture, we will continue to support citizenship free of discrimination and the building of an intercultural state with the inclusion of indigenous peoples. And we are going to continue to work in a coordinated way with all agencies of this state. And I wish you a happy International Day of the World's Indigenous Peoples.
Making this presentation possible, and kindly ask that the delegation of Peru convey our thanks and appreciation to Vice Minister Nunta for her participation in this meeting. I will now offer the floor to Ms. Lily Calderon, representative of the Pan-Amazonian Ecclesial Network. Ms. Calderon, welcome. You have the floor.
Madam Chair, Mr. Secretary General of the OAS, a rapporteur of the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights for Indigenous Questions, and to those who have spoke before me and represent the distinguished governments participants. On this significant day for Indigenous peoples, it is an honor to speak to you from the Pan-Amazonian Ecclesial Network, a voice of Native peoples, to share the solidarity and fraternal embrace of the 9 Latin American countries where our network operates and accompanies the struggles. The church is not in the Amazon like someone who's packed his bags to leave after exploiting it. From the beginning, it has been present there in the Amazon with missionaries, religious congregations, priests, lay people, and bishops. And it's presence is decisive for the future of this area. The Amazon represents numerous and complex challenges. This part of the earth is the biome where life is expressed in a extreme diversity and megadiversity as a gift of God for all. However, this is a region that is increasingly devastated and threatened. Large-scale extractive projects, monocultures, and climate change are placing the natural environment at serious risk and threaten the dignity and self-determination of peoples. Pope Francis offers us, in this perspective, a very specific orientation. Our vocation is to be stewards of all creation, to be respectful of all of God's creatures and for the environment in which we live. And therefore, we accept our mission on the importance of the Amazon for all of humanity and to recognize the essential role of indigenous and Afro-descendant peoples, and particularly the role of women in the construction of life and of all human beings in the planet. The challenge today is even greater since our models of consumption have generated an unprecedented pressure on this Amazonian territory. We've responded since 2016 to this pressure with the implementation of schools for the promotion, defense, and protection of human rights, with which we try to bring together all leaders of the 9 countries of the Amazonian region to be educated and trained in these rights. We've just finished the 3rd edition of this school in Manaus, Brazil, in which 26 leaders from 6 countries participated. Therefore, as a network, we are committed to the defense of human rights, particularly to the rights of indigenous peoples, of riverside dwellers, as well as Afro-descendants and urban populations, with respect and care for the environment in the Amazon and advocacy in local, national, and international policies that would be favorable to the Amazonian territories, analyzing the context, the reality of our situation in the Amazonian region through the publication of Pan-Amazonian regional reports, which are the product of these schools in order to promote the development of the Pan-Amazonian network. This year, as in previous years, we have ensured that indigenous communities have fully participated in the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues of the United Nations. In this forum, together with the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, we presented our 2nd regional report of human rights violations in the Amazon region, Pan-Amazon region, and the Commission's own report for the free determination of peoples, which give a detailed report on the situation of indigenous brothers and sisters. Since its founding in 2014, our network has created agreements with various different organizations, the UN rapporteurs, the IHCHR, in order to join forces in the fight against violations of human rights, collective rights, as well as to environmental damage. Good news report is that yesterday, on the 8th of August, we have recently signed a joint declaration on the protection of the Amazon and its indigenous peoples, Quilombolas and Ribereño peoples, with the Organization of American States. This is a sign of the commitment and deep concern for the peoples that make up our Americas. This includes proposals for the member states present here today, the ratification and implementation of the Escazú Agreement that would guarantee the territory and all the resources that exist in it, health, access to clean water, and full participation of our peoples, and particularly of women. Likewise, along these same lines, all of the recommendations are included in our 2nd report on human rights violations described above. We strive every day to be in the small struggles and in the great hopes of our indigenous peoples and communities with whom we want to cast our lot, to continue in the struggle so that every day will be the 9th of August. Thank you. Thank you very much for your attention.
The Permanent Council that owing to bad weather in Panama, Ms. Sarah Omi, President of the Mesoamerica Women's Territorial Leaders Coordinating Committee of Panama, is unable to connect. Please accept our apologies on behalf of Panama. Having heard informative remarks shared by our guests, we will now proceed with comments and observations from delegations of the member states. The chair respectfully asks member states to abide by the 5-minute maximum allowed under the rules of procedure of the Permanent Council. I recognize the Ambassador of Bolivia. You have the floor, sir.
Señora Presidenta, señor Secretario General.
Madam Chair, Mr. Secretary General, Assistant Secretary General, ambassadors, very good days. The plurinational state of Bolivia congratulates this celebration of the Indigenous Peoples' Day in commemoration of the first working group of the United Nations on Indigenous Populations, celebrated some 40 years ago in Geneva on the 9th of August of 1982, and brought because of a decision of 1994's General Assembly. This commemoration, which focused on indigenous women, considers the 480 million indigenous people in the world, human beings of great value because in many cases, unlike our own, they live free of hate and discrimination and individualism. In Bolivia, those of us who have had the honor of work alongside our indigenous brothers and sisters have repeated a phrase that we repeat today very proudly with great dignity. Indigenous peoples are the moral reserve of humanity. They are the moral reserve because of their respect for Mother Earth, for their values of complementarity and solidarity, which are so necessary for humanity today. They are the moral reserve because of their capacity to survive adverse conditions, and because of their ability to teach the world that we do not live in nature, but we live with nature. In contrast to the anthropocentric view that has done so much damage to our planet Earth. For this reason, it is of great importance for our countries and for our multilateral organization, as is the case for the Organization of American States, to develop and to create policies that are respectful of their identity, that give indigenous peoples, the original nations as we have considered them in Bolivia, the privileged place that is theirs in the social development and in the political life of our nations. Moreover, each and every one of us must learn every day from the humanist vision of our indigenous brothers. Madam Chair, in Latin America, 40 million indigenous peoples live in different countries and nations that are in different countries. In Bolivia, 62% self-identifies as being from an indigenous people group, an indigenous population, in the most recent census. This reality is reflected in our society and in our now plurinational state. For centuries, indigenous peoples were marginalized and discriminated against and even exterminated. However, they never stopped resisting and fighting for their liberation under the leadership of Tupac Amaru and Tupac Amaru. Many generations passed until an indigenous person became the president of our country and transformed our history. Evo Morales Ayma in 2006, as president, led political, social transformations, but also in a recognition of our plural and diverse origins with respect for all human beings. Fundamental to a healthy and dignified role for all. The Constitution of 2009 that for the first time recognized as a structural part of the state the role of indigenous peoples changed the history of the shameful history of domination and pain of Bolivian history. Finally, this was changed to a history to a story of equality that has made of Bolivia a country that today looks with faith and hope to the future, a country that has taken its destiny into its own hands, and a nation that believes in itself. With hand in hand with indigenous peoples in power, we hope this never changes. Indigenous peoples will govern and continue to govern Bolivia, even here in the participation of the Organization of American States in the regrettable situation that occurred in Bolivia in 2019. Let me conclude by recognizing the role of indigenous women in the preservation and transmission of traditional knowledge in the Americas. Indigenous women in Bolivia have always had key roles from the struggle for independence from Spain to our current date. Let me mention Bartolina Cise, an indigenous leader who, together with Tupac Katari, carried out an uprising of indigenous peoples prior to the War of Independence, or Silvia Guasfarte, an indigenous woman who presided the Constitutional Convention and founded the Bolivian Constitution in the adoption of that Constitution in January of 2019. Their roles, their leadership were of greater struggle and greater sacrifice than that of male leaders within their communities, and to them we owe all of our recognition, respect, and honor. Many thanks, Madam Chair. Colombia, you have the floor. Good morning, Mr. Secretary General, Madam Chair, Assistant Secretary General, delegates. Colombia recognizes itself as a pluri-ethnic and pluricultural state and seeks to work in an inclusive and participatory manner with all ethnic groups in keeping with our constitutional order. For the Colombian state, these spaces of dialogue are key to creating our nation in a coherent way to promote participation of indigenous peoples in Colombia. Since 1996, we have created the Permanent Consultation Group with indigenous nations, which has as its role coordinating and consulting on all administrative and legislative decisions that would affect them, protecting their fundamental rights and establishing the ILO Convention rights of consultation with indigenous peoples. The participation of indigenous peoples in these processes is underscored by a recognition of indigenous peoples who are organized in 5 organizations. Traditionally, in regions, there are indigenous organizations that represent the rights of these people. The consultation group or table ensures the participation of the organizations with recognition of the uses and traditional customs of those peoples. As a result of a constitutional mandate, Colombia recognized the collective rights of indigenous peoples in Colombia and the territorial rights for the formulation of policies that would benefit indigenous peoples. As regards their political participation, there are 6 election congressional spots for, as well as judicial authorities that would create procedures and regulations subject to the Colombian Constitution and laws, taking into consideration the circumstances and particular vulnerabilities. The protection of indigenous women is of particular importance. This with the program for the protection of fundamental rights of indigenous people and the institutionalization of a program to orient and implement and follow up and evaluate the policies and plans and projects of the government that would develop the rights of indigenous women and their families. We also underscore the training of indigenous women in issues such as fundamental rights and prevention of violence. We note that there are approximately 68 indigenous languages spoken in Colombia. Among these, 65 Indo-American or indigenous languages. Many of them are at risk, and for this reason, we protect and support the protection of indigenous languages through our Ministry of Culture. Let me underscore that the new government elected in Colombia recognizes the importance of the indigenous communities in the construction of our nation and ensuring the well-being of all of our people. Gustavo Petro, our president, has assigned important posts to 3 indigenous peoples. Leonor Zavala Torres as ambassador, a Waka indigenous leader, who is the first indigenous leader to have such a political role.
Muchas gracias, señora presidenta.
Thank you, Madam Chair, Mr. Secretary General, Assistant Secretary General, dear colleagues, ambassadors, ladies and gentlemen. Honduras is pleased to participate in this extraordinary session of the Permanent Council to commemorate the International Day and the 5th Inter-American Week of Indigenous Peoples under the theme, The Role of Indigenous Women in the Preservation and Transmission of Traditional Knowledge in the Americas. We recognize the efforts, the collective efforts of the Secretary General to commemorate this 5th Inter-American Week of Indigenous Peoples and appreciate the interventions of those who have participated as panelists in this morning. The role of Indigenous women is unquestionably a significant contribution to humanity. Their traditions, their cultural contributions ensure and add to the well-being. Xiomara Castro, the president of Honduras, has launched the program Our Roots, Nuestras Raíces, to strengthen the role and the well-being of native peoples in our country. There will be a series of projects that will include a number of ambitious components. One is a component of intercultural and traditional knowledge education that will promote in all levels of our education system an appreciation and an understanding of traditional indigenous knowledge. A second component is access to public services. Another is the strengthening of food supplies and food security. This was a result of the work done by Jose Manuel Zelaya in his administration in the Honduran Social Investment Fund. This has as its objective that indigenous people not be considered as a folk object or a product. Indigenous women have been at the forefront of the protection of their communities. I wouldn't want to just repeat, but the habits of discrimination or male dominance, machismo, have contributed to this damaging relationship. Our indigenous martyr, human rights defender, who gave her life in protection, Berta Cáceres, assassinated in March of 2016. But Berta has not died. She has simply been multiplied. Her legacy for the protection of the planet continues today by many people throughout the world. Currently, many indigenous women work to protect their communities, such as the Garifuna Miguel Miranda, who seek to protect her homeland under the government of Xiomara Castro, originating the original native peoples of our country, led by their women leaders, have again taken a role in center stage. Suriname, you have the floor.
It is commendable that the World Day and Inter-American Week to commemorate the indigenous peoples has been proclaimed. In Suriname, we do not only commemorate this day, but we actually celebrate this day with the indigenous peoples. That is because in Suriname, this day has been declared a national holiday. All over the country, there are festivities which are led by the indigenous peoples themselves. In the past days, our president visited several indigenous communities. He stated that by declaring the day for the indigenous people a national holiday, the country has shown respect for its original population. By declaring August 9 a national holiday, Suriname has recognized its history and has acknowledged the contribution of the indigenous peoples to its development. The president also mentioned that since Suriname became independent, there have been improvements in the situation of the indigenous population. He mentioned education, health, infrastructure, safe drinking water, electricity, and social services. More can and will be done, however. The president stressed that the indigenous people are an integral part of the population and should be treated as such. This, however, does not mean that everybody has to become similar. No, every ethnic group can maintain its own identity. We call this unity in diversity. The theme of this commemoration is the role of indigenous women in the preservation and transmission of traditional knowledge in the Americas. This theme stresses the importance of women as preservers and transmitters of traditional knowledge. Let me start by stressing that Suriname is proud of its indigenous women and the contribution they have made so far. The question, however, is what traditional knowledge needs to be preserved and transmitted. Traditional knowledge in Suriname, first of all, has to do with the language. We have four main indigenous languages. It is Carib, Arawak in the coastal areas, and Trio or Tareño and Wayana in the hinterland. In addition, there are several smaller language groups as well. These languages are still spoken and should be preserved, especially Carib and Arawak, because they tend to get spoken less. Another part of traditional knowledge has to do with norms and values as part of the culture, where women play an essential role in transmitting it to the children. Arts and craft are also part of traditional knowledge, and here we see that in certain skill areas, sometimes there are just a few persons, mostly women, who still have these skills. These women should be supported and encouraged to transmit their skills to the next generation. At the same time, however, the younger generation should become more aware of their ancestry and be encouraged to learn these skills themselves. Of course, there are many more traditional skills, such as planting and harvesting, traditional medicine, but also cooking, preservation of food, storytelling, which includes the preservation of history. These are areas where women play a key role in preserving and transmitting this knowledge. In Suriname, we also see more and more indigenous women in leadership positions, including women who are now chief of a village. Important is that there should be more general appreciation for indigenous culture and traditional knowledge in society, since this will trigger the indigenous society to get more self-esteem and become more self-confident. This will also lead to re-evaluation of what they have and provide internal and external incentives to preserve it. The commemoration of the indigenous peoples and the national holiday are signs that a wider society in Suriname demonstrates its appreciation for indigenous people and their culture. This in itself is a positive incentive for the indigenous peoples to re-evaluate their own knowledge. Of course, the rights of indigenous people are very important and already part of several laws in Suriname. Also, the traditional authorities of the indigenous people are recognized by the government. The current government has drafted a more inclusive law on tribal rights including land rights. This law is now at the National Assembly, which hopefully will adopt it. My delegation congratulates all indigenous peoples and the OAS with this important day. Thank you.
Thank you, Excellency. I now offer the floor to St. Vincent and the Grenadines.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Secretary General, Assistant Secretary General, distinguished permanent representatives and alternates, permanent observers, staff of the Secretariat, invited guest speakers, good morning. Madam Chair, my delegation expresses gratitude to the Assistant Secretary General and his office for continuing the momentum on this topic, much deserving of recognition. My delegation also expresses its appreciation to the panelists for supporting the OAS in its commemorative week of activities. Madam Chair, today we recognize the strength and resilience of Indigenous women and their immeasurable contribution to the richness and diversity of many of our cultures. The acquisition of full rights is a slow process and is fraught with challenges. Since Indigenous women cannot continue to be marginalized and cannot enjoy their human rights, there is need for greater advocacy on their behalf, and more importantly, for them to have a seat at the policy-making table where their voices can be heard and their needs appropriately articulated for due consideration and inclusion. Madam Chair, the Escazú Agreement, the first regional environmental treaty, which entered into force this year, can protect the rights of Indigenous women. Respecting their knowledge of traditional medicine or medicinal plants and traditional practices or ceremonies can assist in reducing the exploitation of natural resources and contribute to improve management of the environment. My delegation urges member states who have not yet done so to become a party to and ratify the agreement, which speaks, among others, to the right of having a healthy environment. Chair, my delegation encourages member states to continue supporting female-owned Indigenous businesses, continue to support them in using digital technologies and the STEM framework so that they can develop their competitive advantage and promote and protect their intellectual property rights. Chair, the preservation and the transmission of the cultural heritage of Indigenous peoples is critically important. Language, the expression of Indigenous peoples' identity, should be preserved as a vehicle carrying elements of tradition and culture from one generation to another. Sadly, however, Indigenous languages are at risk of becoming extinct if they are not codified in some way and incorporated into our society in areas such as the public service, the media, education, and healthcare programs. Recognizing the important function of Indigenous languages, in 2001, the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, UNESCO, proclaimed the Garifuna language a masterpiece of the oral and intangible heritage of humanity. The Garifuna are descendants of St. Vincent and the Grenadines, who were exiled by the British to the Grenadine island of Balassu. They were later deported to Roatan Island off the coast of Honduras in 1797, following which they settled in neighboring countries such as Belize and Guatemala. Due to the strict British rule during the period of colonization, the few remaining Garifuna and the surviving Kalinago people were prohibited from speaking their languages and practicing their culture and traditions. This led to the unfortunate loss of the language and traditions in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. The government of St. Vincent and the Grenadines, however, through its collaboration with local historians and Garifuna descents, is intent on rectifying this ill, righting this historic wrong, and reintroducing the Garifuna language and rich culture into the country. Madam Chair, my delegation continues to support the efforts of the OAS in raising the level of awareness of the contribution of women and Indigenous people to the development of all our societies. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, St. Vincent and the Grenadines. I now offer the floor to Peru.
Señora Madam Chair, Mr. Secretary General, Assistant Secretary General, permanent representatives, delegates, Peru salutes the interventions made and thanks the organization for this special session of the Permanent Council, which allows us to refer to progress with regard to human rights of Indigenous peoples. We have a national policy for intercultural focus, and this is mandatory for all sectors of the state and different levels of government. And it allows us to coordinate and provide for mechanisms in order to ensure the exercise of the rights of our culturally diverse population, especially of Indigenous peoples and the Afro-Peruvian people, promoting a state which recognizes cultural diversity and also acts with cultural relevance and also is inclusive and works to fight against discrimination. One of the important points of its implementation has been the establishment of a center for native languages where there are interpreters and translators, where there is remote and on-site translation and interpretation. And this is to ensure access to public services for citizens who speak an Indigenous or native language. The right to collective knowledge is protected by a law that we have in Peru. We also project collective ancestral knowledge and another law which protects the different biological and biodiversity that is protected by Indigenous peoples. This allows for Indigenous peoples to benefit from the use of their collective knowledge. And there is a public registry for collective knowledge of Indigenous peoples. With respect to the use of Indigenous languages, Peru recognizes in its constitution these native languages, and they are official in their territory of use. It also promotes the use of this language. Since August 2016, we have a national plan for Indigenous languages. This aims to ensure the linguistic rights of Indigenous people who speak Indigenous languages, and also seeks to improve public services in these languages. We have a computer service which include some Indigenous languages at a departmental and local level. If a language is considered to be official, it must be used gradually and implemented gradually in the services of the state, and it has the same legal value as Spanish. 1,200 districts, 150 provinces, 76% of our country, and 22 departments, which is a large part of our territory, have one or more Indigenous languages spoken in their territory, which means there must be the use of these languages in public service to guarantee the rights of its inhabitants. In the framework of the decade of Indigenous languages, which was declared by the UN General Assembly, calls your attention to the loss of Indigenous languages and also the need to preserve them and promote them nationally and internationally. With respect to the right to participation, the Working Group on Indigenous Peoples, created in 2014, brings together the 7 most important Indigenous associations in Peru. This is a space for dialogue dialogue between the executive branch and indigenous peoples to propose public policies and to follow up on public policies that have an impact on them. They are also observers to the UN Development Program, the ILO, and also the Office of the Public Defenders in Peru. Indigenous peoples who are in situation of isolation and first contact, this includes 20 indigenous peoples. These are 9,000 people, 7,000 who are isolated and 2,000 who are in first contact. These populations usually live in the woods in remote areas. They are very vulnerable, and they also need large areas to be able to protect their identity and their peoples. Peru has a national protection system for these people and is one of the first countries to do so. Thank you very much. The chair has offered the floor to Paraguay. Thank you, Chair. Paraguay would like to join in with others to celebrate this important International Day of the World's Indigenous Peoples and the 5th Inter-American Week for Indigenous Peoples. This is an achievement for the Organization of American States, which is seeking to preserve and transmit the traditional knowledge of the indigenous peoples of the Americas. We especially would like to thank our panelists who have called our attention to the transcendental role of indigenous women in the protection of their rights. In recent decades in our country, we have issued a favorable legal framework to recognize indigenous rights. Among them, participation, or the right to participation, which allows for self-determination and autonomy of indigenous peoples, and for allowing them to decide on their development if it affects their beliefs and well-being, and also to determine their own socioeconomic progress. This was implemented under our Constitution of 1999. It refers to indigenous peoples and ILO Convention 169. Law 904, which is from 1980, which is the Statute of the Indigenous Peoples, and the creation of the Indigenous Peoples Institute in Paraguay. This institute is now implementing the indigenous plan for the next decade, and this includes the principle of consent under free and informed conditions. We also issued a decree in 2018 which establishes a protocol for consultation and for free and prior informed consent. This is a historical landmark with respect to our regulations so that they can make progress. This protocol ensures a process that allows for appropriate participation of indigenous people to protect their rights. Also, there is the UN decision to proclaim the decade of indigenous languages. We'd like to highlight the importance for Paraguay, where we have Guarani and Spanish as our official languages, and 90% of our people speak Guarani. So we believe Guarani is an important vehicle as artistic expression, and this allows for us to build an inclusive society with the aim of preserving and transmitting traditional knowledge of native languages. All Paraguayans are proud of speaking Guarani. It allows us for us to transmit knowledge to our next generation. We recognize that we have many deficits. We must work harder to address the challenges we face, especially with respect to the role of women, who are key in protecting and preserving our traditional knowledge. So we would like to again emphasize that our commitment is to ensure the rights and interests of indigenous peoples that are enshrined in our legal system. In Guarani, we say, thanks and have a wonderful day. That is all. Thank you very much, Chair.
To Trinidad and Tobago.
Thank you, Chair. At the outset, the Permanent Mission of Trinidad and Tobago wishes to express its appreciation to you, Madam Chair, for convening this special meeting of the Permanent Council to commemorate the 2022 Inter-American Week for Indigenous Peoples. I wish to also extend gratitude to the distinguished panel for the timely and enlightening presentations this morning. The government and the people of Trinidad and Tobago are pleased to join with member states in acknowledging and highlighting the important contributions of our indigenous peoples, and in particular in this year's theme, Role of Indigenous Women in the Preservation and Transmission of Traditional Knowledge, places the spotlight on indigenous women who have been instrumental in preserving the culture and tradition of indigenous populations. The government of Trinidad and Tobago has recognized the importance of preserving our own indigenous traditions and culture in 1990. And in 1990, the government officially recognized the Santa Rosa First Peoples community as the representative organization of Trinidad and Tobago's indigenous peoples. Since then, successive administrations of the government in Trinidad and Tobago have ensured the continued preservation of the historical legacy and revitalization of the First Peoples, their cultural heritage, systems, and traditions. Some of the efforts and activities include the Annual Day of Recognition, celebrated on October 14th every year to mark the contributions of warrior chief Hayarima and the presence of indigenous peoples. The celebration of a national holiday on October the 13th, 2017, at the close of the annual First Peoples Heritage Week to recognize and celebrate the presence and contribution of Trinidad and Tobago's First Peoples. The allocation of 25 acres of land in 2014 for the establishment of a model Amerindian village to exhibit various aspects of its history, culture, art, and craft. The submission of a list of sites deemed sacred sites by the 3 indigenous groups to the National Trust of Trinidad and Tobago, which is the statutory body responsible for the consideration, recognition, and protection of national heritage sites, and the hosting of the annual Indigenous Food Fair by Partners for First Peoples Development, which is geared towards fostering, reclaiming, and continuing to educate on the cultural heritage of the First Peoples of Trinidad and Tobago. Madam Chair, with this year's theme in mind, I wish to highlight that the Santa Rosa First Peoples have established women as leaders since 1875, which attests to the value and respect placed on them. I wish to recall the contributions of former Santa Rosa Queen, Mrs. Jennifer Cassar, who passed away on July 27, 2018. Mrs. Cassar was a career civil servant and the 6th Carib Queen since the title's creation in 1875. She served as the Carib Queen from 2011 until her death in 2018, and was the first Carib Queen to hold a secular job. Mrs. Cassar is remembered for continuing the efforts of her predecessor, Ms. Valentina Medina, in seeking formal recognition by the government for the contributions of the indigenous community to the development of Trinidad and Tobago. These efforts culminated in the granting of a national holiday on October 13, 2017, as mentioned above, in the recognition of the First Peoples of Trinidad and Tobago. Mrs. Kassar is also attributed with pursuing the establishment of an Amerindian village in Blanchisseuse, for which the government granted 100 acres of land. In closing, the Permanent Mission of Trinidad and Tobago wishes to remind that the government of Trinidad and Tobago is committed to the promotion and protection of the rights of indigenous peoples as agreed to under the framework of the United Nations and this Organization of American States. These commitments solely serve to reiterate rights already enshrined in the Constitution of Trinidad and Tobago to its citizens, and which are vigorously pursued by actions undertaken by the government and guided by international frameworks. We look forward to further collaboration with member states, as well as the organization, in ensuring the preservation of indigenous culture and tradition. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Trinidad and Tobago. I now offer the floor to Mr. Gustavo Tare.
Thank you very much, Chair. The Constitution of Venezuela regulates the rights of indigenous peoples. And I would like to read the first lines of the chapter of this Constitution, which says that the Constitution recognizes indigenous peoples, their political and economic structures, their religions, language, and culture, and their rights over traditional ancestral lands, which are necessary to ensure their way of life. This constitutional provision and others have been violated by the dictatorial government of Venezuela. And I've repeated this many times. We especially emphasize and denounce the irreparable damage suffered by indigenous peoples due to violence, due to state and irregular militias, the invasion of their territories, illegal mining, and other violations. Although we have reported this and denounced this at an international level, the state of Venezuela has left them defenseless. The IACHR issued a communique which denounced the massacre of the Yanomami people at the hands of state agents. There are high levels of violence, according to the IACHR, especially against indigenous peoples, sexual violence, forced labor. This has also been confirmed by the UN Rapporteur for Human Rights in a thematic report with regard to indigenous peoples. Now, specifically with regard to the commemoration of this year, which is the role of women in preserving and transmitting traditional knowledge in the Americas, so that women can play this role, it is necessary to have the rule of law which allows for the free development of indigenous peoples with security. We must work together to avoid our indigenous peoples disappearing because of violence, that the transmission and preservation of traditional knowledge is done in prosperous communities. In order to do so, the Venezuelan state, which is led up by a gang of criminals, must ensure that indigenous peoples have a right to their land, and they must put an end to their massacres. They must ensure their rights when others try to usurp their territories. Finally, on behalf of Venezuelan people, we would ask people to raise their voices to defend the rights of indigenous peoples and other vulnerable groups in Venezuela beyond any ideology or political affinity. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Chair. First of all, the delegation of Panama would like to recognize the work of the Assistant Secretary General in organizing this commemorative week. On behalf of Saraomi, we also would like to apologize because due to bad weather, she was not allowed to come to this session. And this is one of the women that we wanted to celebrate this week. She is an attorney and has a postgraduate degree in human rights, indigenous peoples, and international cooperation. And she is a representative of the Mesoamerican Network and leaders in Mesoamerica. This is an arena for political consultation of indigenous women. She's also a member of the Jumarajuya group. She's also a member of the Organization of United Women for Biodiversity and the head of Indigenous Women's Group at the Women of Institute in Panama. She also worked in other agencies showing her leadership and contributions to indigenous peoples, especially youth and indigenous women. Among her achievements, she has been part of the Dupa Shapers community. She also was recognized and got a prize in 2014. And she has been recognized for her contribution to peace and human rights. And she was on the Forbes Central American list of the most 100 most important women. And she could not be at the council in person, but she has sent us a video. Thank you. I'm Sara Omi Kasama. I'm an indigenous person from the Mbara people, and I am the president of the coordinator of indigenous women in Mesoamerica. This year, the United Nations is emphasizing the important role of women in preserving and transmitting traditional knowledge in the Americas. I want to reaffirm that this is unflagging work that women do every day because we are responsible for protecting our spiritual life and also maintaining resistance of our people. So I invite all of you to continue to work hand in hand with women, with girls, young people, to overcome barriers that cause inequality, that do not allow us to have equitable development. Women must continue to build peace and security in our communities, in all indigenous peoples, hand in hand with the state, to continue promoting those fundamental rights that indigenous people have, especially women. Good morning, Chair. Colleagues, the delegation of Ecuador would like to begin by thanking the Office of the Assistant Secretary General for organizing this special meeting. Also to thank our panelists and also the introduction of the Secretary General and also those who have preceded me in speaking. I wanted to also recognize Cristina Males, the Vice prefect of the province of Imbabura. She is an indigenous woman, and she was elected through popular vote in her province. The democratic support means that her participation in the OAS is legitimate. We wanted to honor the role of indigenous women in the preservation and transmission of traditional knowledge in the Americas. With the presence of an Ecuadorian indigenous woman who has talked about the work in the province of Imbabura. This is important work, which is very valuable for Ecuador, and also with elements that can be replicated in the region. Ecuador is diverse, and our region, of course, is undeniably diverse, but we are looking for unity and common good. More rights for more people. Leave no one behind. No one. What we have heard today have talked about difficulties and challenges faced by indigenous peoples, especially indigenous women. But above all, we have heard the hopeful message about implementing initiatives and state policies which are aimed at overcoming these difficulties with a respectful homage to the preservation and transmission of traditional knowledge in the Americas and in Ecuador. Although it has been difficult for our interpreters because they don't speak indigenous languages, I did want to say this. Thank you.
Thank you, Ecuador. I now offer the floor to Guyana.
Secretary General, Assistant Secretary General, Madam Chair, distinguished guests, ambassadors, alternates, and permanent representatives. Guyana thanks the presenters for their enlightened interventions, as we also express our appreciation to the Office of the ASG for this week of activities during which we celebrate the International Day of the World's Indigenous People and the 5th Inter-American Week for Indigenous Peoples. With the coming of the European colonizers in the area that in time became Guyana, the indigenous Amerindian peoples were pushed back away from the coast and from the banks of the lower reaches of the main rivers where plantations were developed, and away from a few locations in the hinterland where government stations and mines were developed. However, in the last decades of the colonial period, the awareness grew of Guyana becoming a country emerging on the contributions of its 6 ancestral peoples, including the native indigenous peoples called Amerindians by the British colonizers. The equal participation of Amerindian indigenous peoples in the economic, social, and political life of our country is steadily growing as the level of provision of utilities, services, health, education, communication, and transport links are brought to the same levels as the more developed coastlands, and as our different peoples integrate naturally. Our President, His Excellency President Irfan Ali, has been regularly advocating one Guyana, in which all our 6 peoples are embraced in all aspects of national development. Chair, in Guyana today, indigenous peoples live throughout our country and enjoy the full rights of all citizens, and also some historical special rights. In particular, there are Amerindian villages which enjoy a grant of land held in communal ownership and certain local administrative authority. Village authorities can enter into various contracts, but the land cannot be pledged as collateral. The departing British had listed 65 such villages. Today, more than 150 villages have been listed, and the government is proceeding with the process of formally establishing and surveying boundaries and granting documents of title. About 14% of Guyana's land area has already been granted as Amerindian villages. Chair, capacity building of all our 800,000 citizens is central to our government efforts of national development. Quality education of all our people is continuously being improved. Our Amerindian people were included in the 1,000 doctors and other health professionals trained in Cuba over 2004 to 2012, and they are well represented in the 20,000 online scholarships for tertiary training offered by the government, as well as other training opportunities. Amerindian indigenous women are included in our National Women's Innovation and Investment Network, which is empowering women to become financially independent through technical vocational training programs, increased literacy, and grants to encourage small business ownership. The Youth Entrepreneurial Apprenticeship Project provides training and support for youths to be involved in business relevant to the opportunities and needs in their villages. Chair, the government of Guyana values and is especially proud of Guyana's diverse cultures, traditions, and customs. We celebrate annually the month of September as Amerindian Heritage Month, with a focus on Amerindian development and the Amerindian contribution to Guyana. Amerindians are present more and more in all positions throughout our country, as our six peoples converge into one. Chair, my intervention here contains considerable portions of the statement the Honorable Pauline Sukai, Minister of Amerindian Affairs of Guyana, herself an Amerindian, delivered to the 21st session of the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues earlier this year on April 26th at the United Nations headquarters. Of note also, our permanent representative to the United Nations, Ambassador Caroline Rodriguez Burkett, herself an Amerindian woman, was earlier a Minister of Amerindian Affairs and a Minister of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation of Guyana. Chair, in closing, I reaffirm Guyana's commitment to the promotion and full implementation of the provisions of the 2007 United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and the 2017 General Assembly adoption of the Plan of Action for implementation of the American Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. I thank you.
Thank you, Guyana. I'm pleased to offer the floor to El Salvador.
Thank you, Madam Chair. El Salvador joins its voice to this commemoration within the fifth week-long recognition of Indigenous peoples. We acknowledge the important messages that we've heard from representatives of Indigenous groups today. Women, Indigenous women must be understood for the fundamental role that they play in their families and communities, as well as the bearers and transmitters of traditional knowledge, for which we must recognize their important historical role. Likewise, they play a communicative and collective role as safeguarders of the scientific traditional knowledge, and also take the initiatives in protecting initiatives for education and the protection of territory and land. In the reform of Article 63 of the recent constitutional reforms in El Salvador, we understand that El Salvador will take into account the role, the traditions, and spiritual heritage of indigenous peoples, and as well as in recognition of their rights within the legal framework. Indigenous peoples are recognized to have collective and individual rights under the aegis of the human rights recognized under the Salvadorian Constitution. The protection and promotion of the artisanal tradition and know-how of the indigenous peoples is also recognized. To comply with the mandate of coordinating national policies for indigenous peoples with other state agencies, we have an interinstitutional group that plans and articulates policies that would affect indigenous peoples and have coordinated making health services available to indigenous communities and other initiatives that address the traditional cultural know-how and support for training for women indigenous leaders as well. We've also carried out trainings for government officials on multiculturality to provide services to indigenous populations with a more sensitive nature, understanding the self-determination of those groups. We've also worked to regulate new municipalities which have been recognized now, a regulation that will be the basis to develop projects and initiatives for these populations. Finally, we have approved initiatives to revitalize the role of indigenous languages and strengthen the identity of indigenous communities in El Salvador through the production and promotion of Nahua in mass communications, through digital media, or paper publications. On the last 28th of February, the Ministry of Culture presented the first edition of The Little Prince in Nahua and Spanish. Madam Chair, with the recognition that we are a multi-ethnic and multicultural state, our commitment to indigenous peoples as part of the sustainable and integrated development of our country as part of the Americas, with giving particular attention to the role of women, youth, and children, and the protection of their rights against discrimination and all forms of violence. Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, El Salvador. Thank you, Madam Chair. To begin with, I'd like to thank the Secretary, Assistant Secretary General, and you as well as President of the Permanent Council for having convened this very important meeting today. On the occasion of the Day of Indigenous Peoples and the 5th Inter-American Week on Indigenous Peoples, we gather together to meet and recognize the important contributions of Native peoples and Indigenous peoples to our territories and to our countries, and recognize the contribution of Indigenous women and the essential role that they have played as leaders and guardians of traditional knowledge, language, and cultural traditions. We don't have to go very far to understand that women are the linchpin to the protection as guardians of the environment, healers, and implementers of reconciliation, and leaders of their communities fighting against systemic discrimination and the unfair impact of colonialism on their peoples. Indigenous peoples have the right to participate and have the right to be heard and participate in decisions that affect them. Today, it is time that we put in place this aspect, as we must learn to listen to and understand that our indigenous and native peoples must be able to participate in our development, and we must benefit from the wealth of their knowledge as well. I will continue in English.
Decade of Indigenous languages. And several speakers have commented on that. And let me echo the voice of so many others to say that we need to do all that we can to support and to preserve Indigenous languages so that they can continue to be a means for transmitting, preserving traditional knowledge by and among Indigenous peoples and in their own voices. I was very glad this morning we had a chance to listen, particularly to the Indigenous women on the panel, but I think it's upon us now to also work to support Indigenous women by addressing some of the particular challenges that they face, including gender-based violence and harassment. At the summit just a couple of months ago, June 2022, the Summit of the Americas, Prime Minister Trudeau called for Indigenous peoples to be heard in summits like these and called on other countries to support their meaningful participation. In this body, we should also consider ways in which we can enhance the meaningful participation of Indigenous peoples in our work and deliberations and facilitate a broader engagement with Indigenous peoples, particularly Indigenous women. Indigenous traditional knowledge has made and continues to make valuable and lasting contributions to our society's environmental, cultural, and scientific development. Let us thank the Indigenous women leaders of today for their strength and for their defense of Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous rights. But let's also thank the Indigenous women of the past, whose determination, skill, and tenacity have brought the wisdom of countless generations to our modern world. Our communities, our countries, and our region are significantly richer for it. Thank you.
Thank you, Canada. I now offer the floor to Brazil.
Madam Chair of the Permanent Council, Mr. Secretary General and Assistant Secretary General, ladies and gentlemen, permanent representatives, the Brazilian delegation thanks the interventions of the special guests and panelists, as well as other delegations that have addressed. Along the lines of the theme for this meeting, let me underscore that the Brazilian contribution to this 5th Inter-American Week of Indigenous Peoples includes a recognition of 2 Indigenous women, outstanding Indigenous women that deserve to be, among many others, Maria Aureni Gonzalez da Silva, an Indigenous leader of the Funi ethnic group, who is at the head of the gender and social participation of the FUNAI since the year 2000, and Miriam Casais Ocairo, an Indigenous woman leader born in Tagarada da Serra in the state of Mato Grosso, and who is part of the Aliti Parisi Indigenous group, Indigenous leader, chief, and these are 2 women that we recognize as part of the commemoration of this week. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Argentina.
Muchas gracias, señora Presidenta.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The native indigenous or autochthonous people of Argentina throughout the 19th century and the first half of the 20th century suffered significantly the immigration flows that principally came from Europe to our territory, and which occupied chiefly the cities, the large urban centers. This meant that during the oligarchic governments of the time, the leaders imbued with the positivist philosophy, which was so prevalent at the time, built an image and an official discourse in our country which was much more likely to look to outside sources of progress than to value or understand the wealth that existed in our own indigenous populations throughout so many of our provinces in our country and through vast territories, because of the disregarded the multicultural wealth already present in our indigenous populations. In the last census carried out in our country, for the first time, we included a question to identify our population belonging to an indigenous group. Fortunately, during the governments between the years 2003 and 2015, we saw a new understanding, a new valuing of our condition and our character as an Indo-American population as well, and of the multicultural character of our country, which we always tended or had been seen always in the dominant discourse as the result of a population that was mostly European. This leads me to also posit a situation that is certainly complex and that has to do with the need to strengthen the presence of indigenous languages in our own organization here in the OAS. I raise this as a challenge for us. At the outset, Madam Chair, you mentioned a list of outstanding women leaders. You mentioned Berta Cáceres, Rigoberta Menchú, Elisa Long, and you also mentioned a symbol of Argentina, Milagro Sala. And I would like to conclude for this reason with the words, with her words, and to take the opportunity of my intervention here as a recognition of who Milagro Sala was for the Republic of Argentina, who today has 2,397 days in jail without having committed any other crime other than being an indigenous woman and to be a tireless social worker in our country. And so I conclude with my exhortation to the Inter-American Human Rights, the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, and to the Inter-American authorities to see that in the province of Jujuy, within the government, within the territory of Argentina, the abuses carried out by the governor of that province to look into the deterioration of Milagro Sala's health because of her being jailed, and for the extraordinary social work carried out by Milagro Sala and her group, Barrial Tupac Amaru, on behalf of the most marginalized populations in our country.
Of Chile, as I offer the floor to the United States of America. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. First, I would like to take this opportunity to express my appreciation to the Assistant Secretary General and his staff for bringing us together today to specifically recognize the central role of Indigenous women in preserving and transmitting traditional knowledge. Madam Chair, the United States is proud to join other delegations today in honoring great Indigenous groups throughout the Americas, highlighting the ongoing challenges they face and continue to face in strengthening the leadership of Indigenous women in particular. We thank the speakers for their thoughtful presentations, and appreciate the message that was conveyed to us. The past 2 years, Madam Chair, have been difficult ones in which citizens throughout our hemisphere have faced new and significant challenges. However, we are deeply conscientious of the unique intersectional challenges indigenous communities throughout the hemisphere faced during the pandemic, which has exacerbated persistent problems. The Biden-Harris administration is committed to advancing the protection, support, and prosperity of tribal nations throughout the hemisphere. Madam Chair, my delegation is well aware of the indigenous women that are essential leaders, contributing to the strength, resilience, and growth of their communities in spite of the non-COVID-related challenges facing our indigenous communities in the hemisphere. Combating racism and discrimination is something the Biden-Harris administration is committed to address. These issues that every OAS member state faces, including the United States, are a challenge that we can all work together to overcome. Recognizing and empowering indigenous communities is not only morally just, but also essential to the health and prosperity of all of our communities. Recognition and opportunity must be inclusive, enhancing opportunities for all people while building respect, trust, and understanding across race, ethnicity, gender, disability, sexual orientation, and gender identity. Madam Chair, I assure you that this is a priority of the Biden administration to respect tribal sovereignty and self-governance, particularly at this point in time when our indigenous communities have been disproportionately affected by crisis in our country related to health, the economy, racial justice, and climate change. In support of these commitments, President Biden is taking action to address violence against indigenous communities and missing and murdered indigenous women especially. In November of 2021, President Biden signed the Executive Order 14053 entitled Improving Public Safety and Criminal Justice for Native Americans and Addressing the Crisis of Missing and Murdered Indigenous People. Discussion at the White House Tribal Nations Summit, President Biden declared this to be a matter of dignity, which is the foundation of our nation-to-nation partnership. I would like to finish by stating that as we continue to emerge out of the pandemic, it's important more than ever that all OAS member states are doing all they can to protect the sovereignty and the rights of their indigenous tribal groups and support indigenous women as they continue the work of preserving and transmitting traditional knowledge. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, United States. I'm now pleased to offer the floor to Chile, and I thank you again for your consideration.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you also to the Executive Secretariat for organizing this session, as well as to the panelists and the other delegations who have spoken. We will soon celebrate 200 years of the Parlamento de Tapihue between the Mapuche people and the state of Chile, the first parliament held in our with one of the original native peoples of our country. Nearly 200 years later, the search for a dialogue of our shared culture and our shared territory is again a dream that mobilizes our country. Clearly, this isn't the first time that we have done this. It's a 200-year history with the hope of addressing the desires. We believe a democracy must be challenged to promote identity and cultural diversity of all the peoples within our territory. Only in this way will we address the historical debts that Chile has with original and native peoples. When we speak about women, indigenous women, this is only multiplied because, as was already said very eloquently, an indigenous woman is discriminated not only because she is indigenous, but because she is a woman and as well as because she is poor. There's a triple discrimination here for socioeconomic reasons, indigeneity, as well as for gender reasons. This is one of the best examples of intersectionality. What are we doing today to address this debt? First, we are promoting territorial parliaments that would understand under the United Nations standards. We're also multiplying the redistribution of land that take into account connectivity, access to water, electricity, and adequate infrastructure for communities to be able to develop independently. And along these same lines, with the 11 indigenous peoples that live in our country, for co-management and protection of environmental and scientific heritage, safeguarding the traditional rights of these peoples, as was recently mentioned by our fellow delegate. This example meant that on the 5th of October, we opened again the Easter Island efforts that had been closed for 5 years. Madam Chair, we must remember that this is a difficulty and a challenge that has been more acute for indigenous women, but we see that we must and can be hopeful in a dialogue of mutual respect. As our processes advance, we can find new ways of meeting each other and begin to live in our Americas in all our diversity. Thank you.
Gracias, Presidenta.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And thank you to the Secretary General and for the Permanent Council having convened us here, as Sebastian has just mentioned. The notion of diversity is the overarching notion here, and to work on the idea of indigenous peoples rooted and focusing this theme on the role of indigenous women does not seem to me to be a small matter, but rather an enormous one. The fact is that the militant defense of our traditional knowledge has allowed us to be who we are. Perhaps it's difficult to acknowledge this, but we are this. And these challenges must, at some measure, in some way, be addressed to recognize in our own identity and in our own existential sense, in our multifaceted versatility, we must, as we do now, acknowledge the need to face all of the challenges that our countries face in terms of discrimination, of distortions, and of injustice in terms of the rights of communities and peoples in our Americas. And I think that history is in this way in our favor. As we mature, as we grow, as we acknowledge that we are but one collection of the Americas, we must and do understand that we must be respectful of our history, and respecting our history, I believe, means to rescue our ancestors, not only to safeguard them or to preserve them, that wouldn't be enough, but to order them, to give them their due place. We are our historical identity. We are our indigenous ancestors, our populations, our indigenous populations and peoples. The word indigenous has a precious sort of etymology. Indo means from there, and gen means born from there, born from, and that is who we are. We are born here. We are born in the Americas. So this occasion, this session, is a moving occasion, and it touches us in our soul, in who we in effect are, and rescues as well a path in which our countries are seeking to some degree to address wounds, to redress wounds that over the course of time have existed. I think there is time to redress these wounds. I think that I'm of the thinking, of the theory, that the challenge for us today is this. Those who are living in this time, due to these circumstances, at this time and in this hour, part of our journey is to suture those open wounds and to put them behind us. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Chair. Mexico thanks you for the celebration of this special meeting, and also would like to thank those participating. One of Mexico's strengths is its diversity. It is a pluricultural nation and has 68 indigenous peoples. According to the census, there are 26 million people in our country, and more than 11 million belong to indigenous peoples, and more than 7 million speak an indigenous language. The American Declaration on Indigenous Peoples recognizes the diversity of indigenous peoples and their contribution to our development, and also ensures their rights to their identity. This is also true of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which provides that they have the right to transmit to future generations their history, languages, traditions, philosophy, literature, culture, ways of life, and to use their own names for their peoples and territories. Women who are indigenous peoples contribute greatly to the exercise of this right, and they also contribute to the well-being and development of their peoples. Mexico celebrates this and supports this. In Article 2 of Mexico's Constitution, the commitment and obligation of the state is enshrined to promote and ensure the rights of indigenous peoples to which we have a historical debt. And this is very pressing with respect to indigenous peoples. The government of Mexico recognizes that indigenous men and women and Afro-Mexican people need to have autonomy and self-determination and need to decide on their own development based on their identity. Our government is promoting initiatives so that indigenous peoples are heard at a multilateral level. Indigenous women have played an important role in raising voices of indigenous peoples. Among other achievements, we recognize the work of indigenous leaders who are women who have contributed to processes that led to the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, the creation of the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Peoples, also the mandate of the Special Rapporteur on Indigenous Peoples, and the adoption, of course, of the American Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. Mexico is promoting a constitutional reform which will recognize self-determination and autonomy of indigenous peoples, the right to consultation, right to